Hello, doctors. It's nice to be able to teach a course just for the medical guys and women who managed to help us get through the COVID crisis. Your work is much appreciated, and if I owned a bar, I'd let you drink for free, but as it is, all I can do is teach old books. Price for admission for every doctor is the same. Go fix something that's not working right. Help somebody out who are in some sort of medical mess. You figure out how to do it. I don't know how to do it. I just know there's a lot of that. Okay, that's the price for admission. I want to teach once a month for a year, and I want to go over some of the things that might be of interest to doctors in particular, because doctors, in order to get into medical school, have a very rigid set of undergraduate requirements, and they've often told me that they wish they'd gotten a chance to read books that they thought they might enjoy and profit from, but that they were blocked out by chemistry and physics and biochemistry and all the other stuff you need to be a pre-med. So I tried to focus on some of the books that doctors may have heard of, but never actually looked at. So, among other things, we're going to look at Hippocrates, and we're also going to look at Galen, and we're also going to look at the difference between ancient and modern science, and we're also going to look at natural science and its applications, which take the form of technology, and the implications for culture of the development of natural science. So, we'll talk about some things. All of them in one way or another will touch upon medicine, even the ones that don't immediately obviously seem to. We're going to read Plunkett of Tammany Hall, which is one of the humorously great accounts of American politics. This is Boss Tweed's outfit, and what he argues for is something like decentralized politics. He says, well, look, of course they're thieving, but you're going to have people thieving in any system. You might as well have the system be accountable and responsible to the people that are paying the bill. So over the time of the COVID crisis, I've often thought that decentralization of decision-making might have some advantages. Allowing people to adopt to particular situations. And I think that would probably, in particular, be good for doctors, because the more authority and flexibility you folks have, and the less intrusion you get from bureaucrats and accountants and stuff, probably the better healthcare will be. So let's sit back and think about what the readings were for this week. Now, or this month. I sent out two things. One, read a book on the Presocratics. It'd do you some good. Some of you I've known so long. I taught you in college. I probably taught you this Presocratics 40 years ago. But if so, it's not a bad reread. And the other section that I had given out was a series of short readings which were designed to puzzle you. Okay? First things first, we had, in the short readings, we had a section from the Bible, Book of Exodus. And we find out that if a bull gores someone to death, the bull will be held accountable, it will be convicted of murder, and it will be stoned to death because it is a murderous bull. This is exactly the same punishment that a human murderer gets. So, in other words, the decision to stone the ox to death means that it's being held accountable by laws that we usually apply only to humans, and it's getting a sentence that we would ordinarily expect to be given to a human. Moreover, the bull is treif. You're not allowed to eat it. Why? It has blood pollution. How does that affect the meat? it's guilty of some sin. The sin somehow permeates the meat and makes it unclean, and it has to be gotten rid of, but it's not allowed to be eaten. Okay. Now they also say in this section from Exodus, it's very short but interesting. If a bull gores someone a second time, well, then not only the bull but the owner also is going to be stoned to death. Now I suppose it's something of a relief that the owner is not eaten, but once again, the bull is not eaten either, because the bull has blood pollution and it's just not fit for human consumption. Okay, the question here is, how come we don't hold bulls accountable for murder? In other words, I don't know of any recent prosecution of livestock for murderous conduct, even though I'm sure they do kill things once in a while. And the reason why is that we have a set of categories which separates the human from the other things making up the spatio-temporal world. Let's call that nature, right? What that means is that we don't hold morally accountable things that aren't human beings, because we attribute to them choice and responsibility. But that has not always been the case, and it has not always been obvious what the difference is between things in the world that possess intention and the capacity for free activity, and the things in the world that do not, that are merely the causal outcome of antecedent events. So the question is, for early civilizations, the most archaic, they all come up with the same conception of nature. It's what I call myth physics. You tell the kids a story and it puts them to bed. All right, so they ask you a question, you give them a story. Over time, these stories begin to knit together. And so you'll have the makings of culture out of stories, narratives. And their account of the physical world will be fairly primitive, because, whatever stories they make up, although the details may change, they're all just imaginary accounts of the world, and they don't have much predictive use, and they also aren't very much help in modifying the external world. See, if you think that the external world is not composed of objects but subjects, in other words, if tornadoes and hurricanes and volcanoes and earthquakes were not events or processes, but were rather people, personalities. Well, if that's what you think a volcano is, it makes perfectly good sense to talk to the volcano and ask it not to burn everybody. Same sort of thing with a river. It's not unusual for rivers to be personified and deified in the archaic world. If you think that the Nile River is a god, well, then it makes perfectly good sense to sing the god a song and perform a series of rituals and sacrifice some sort of an animal to the god and make sure that the priests perform the right ritual on the right date so that the Nile will rise in response to the generous treatment by the Egyptians. So, in other words, religious ritual is a kind of technology. It's the technology of people whose account of the physical world is myth. Now, the downside of this technology doesn't work very well. If you get the calendar wrong, which sometimes happens because of the inexact calculation of the year, or if the weather is peculiarly dry or peculiarly wet, if there's a modification of the weather pattern, that can leave the Nile being recalcitrant, in which case there's probably a special set of dances and ceremonies we do to, make up with the Nile. Now, this is worth considering. These ancient people are not stupid, all right? There's not some inferiority in their mental abilities. The stuff they have between their ears is at least as complicated as ours, right? The amount of time we're talking about, 5,000 years, is nothing in evolutionary terms. So the real difference then is not the hardware of the human brain, it's the software, which is my way of thinking about culture, that the hardware of the brain is running. Back in the time, in the earliest phases of human society, when we were living in a mythical world full of ghosts and goblins and spooks and things that go bump in the night, that was like running Angry Birds on a mainframe. In other words, the brain is amazingly powerful, but the demands that are being made on it and the software that is articulating it is very weak and maladaptive. One way of thinking about it is you're only as good as your presuppositions. The presuppositions that archaic people always made was that the world was full of spooks and spirits. I mean, imagine how strange it would have been for them to experience something like an echo. Well, I mean, they don't have a good account of it, so because they don't know much about acoustics, so they make up a story about it. That's what Science 1.0 is. Now, the first scientific revolution that, ever happened is going to happen in Greece. And it's going to change us away from this earlier view of objects being persons. And some of it's actually pretty funny, right? The world is full of things that have meaning rather than randomness. So, for example, in the first book of the Iliad, where do epidemics come from? They come from Apollo. How do we know that? Well, because he's the god of healing and sickness. His priest was disrespected. And when we start making the proper sacrifices and give the priest back his daughter, the priest will be happy, Apollo will be happy, and no one will get sick anymore. That is Science 1.0, right? We account for events in this world by telling a story about some malevolent or benevolent spirit that is causing it to happen. All right. My favorite, in some ways, was the Olympic champion in Greece, Thales. He was an excellent boxer. He won the gold medal, and he won the championship more than once. And one of his competitors took it personally and held a grudge. Thales was honored by his city. They put up a statue of him in the main square. And one night, perhaps alcohol was involved, the disgruntled competitor took out a whip and beat the statue. Now, again, this is an excellent example of someone who attributes personality to objects. In other words, we would never think of a statue as something that would be worth beating if you have a grudge against the person the statue is based upon. Not so this competitor. Not only does he give it a beating, but he at some point wraps the whip around the statue, pulls on it, pulls the statue off its pedestal. It falls on him and kills him. Okay, that's very peculiar, but the response of his family was even more peculiar. They insisted that the statue be prosecuted for murder. It was prosecuted for murder. it was found guilty, and it was thrown into the sea as a punishment. I'm sure the statue learned its lesson. Now, you have to remember, these people are not stupid. They do not have a clear demarcation between subjects and objects. This just looks like a subject, but it did a thing that was malevolent and murderous, or homicidal anyway, and so they held a trial for a piece of stone. The kind of high point of this, if you look at Herodotus, is where Xerxes is invading Greece. He has to cross from Asia Minor into Europe. He wants, so he builds 2 pontoon bridges across the Hellespont. A storm comes up and wrecks the bridges. Xerxes is angry, so all of the bridge builders have their heads cut off. But he's not finished there. He goes down to the sea. He abuses it and threatens it, and then he has his soldiers give the Hellespont, which is a body of water, a good beating with a whip. I think he got 300 lashes. And moreover, he arrested the Hellespont and did that by having his soldiers throw a pair of shackles into the water. So there. Now, keep in mind that the wrong answer to what are we watching here is stupid people doing crazy things. No, not so. These are smart people who are limited by the set of assumptions they have about the world. If you thought that bodies of water could be spiteful, you might be inclined to smack them back as a result. If you thought that the Hellespont had intentions, then there's nothing wrong with holding it accountable when it crosses your plans. So none of these people are crazy. None of these people are stupid. They're just limited by the culture, the software that the hardware is running. Okay. Now, all across the world, Science 1.0 is pretty much the same thing. Daddy, tell us a story. Why is the sky blue? What makes the thunder crash? Questions like that. And if you don't have an answer, the children aren't going to bed. So this is a sort of technology too. It puts the children down. Okay, you make up some stories. The stories begin to interleave. And what you have is a set of narratives which define a whole group of people over time. Right? And these narratives for archaic societies usually take the form of epic poems. In Greece, it was the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it was a kind of farmer's almanac for the Greeks. In other words, all of knowledge, or at least all the knowledge that they could use and could think of, was assumed to be found within Homer. There's something divine about the insight of the great poet. And I might be tempted to say that science begins with the criticism of poetry. About 600 BC, the world's first scientific revolution happens in Ionia, which are the islands between Turkey and Greece. If you've ever been there, they're truly beautiful, and a chance to sail around there is well worth taking. I did it more than once, and I've always loved Greece and the coast of Turkey. It's an idyllic place, and they had one of the world's great breakthroughs. They invented a new way of thinking about the world. And in some ways, it's because they are a crossroads for trade, and I mean also trade in ideas and customs as well as goods, but also they're sufficiently close by to both Egypt and Mesopotamia to inherit a great deal of knowledge from the two river valley civilizations. So that's the closest I can come to explaining why it is this very strange, rather unique change occurs. It's what linguists call a hapax. It's a sign that we only have, or an event for historians, that we only have one of. And so it's hard to know how to classify it or understand what rules govern it because there's only one of it. Hapax exist in things like the Bible or in Aztec glyphs. They're also in Shakespeare. They're not unusual, but they allow for a great deal of latitude in the way you interpret it. So the best I could say is I don't have any certain argument for why the first scientific revolution should happen in Greece or off the coast of Greece, between Greece and Turkey, about 600 BC. Amazingly, a very similar kind of transformation is going to happen in China about 300 BC. Completely independently, Zhu Yan and the School of Naturalists are going to work out an account of the physical world that departs from the tradition, the archaic tradition of myth physics. In both cases, in China and in Greece, these scientific revolutions had unprecedented transformative results for the societies that created them. So one thing I'm going to lay out now, and I'll articulate it over a course of a year, is that every time a scientific revolution occurs, all the other domains of culture have to change. It's not voluntary, it's necessary. It's like a computer changing its operating system. All the applications that used to run on the old operating system have to be changed. It's not biconditional. In other words, it's possible for there to be a transformation in art or a transformation in religion. Think of the expansion of Islam after the death of the Prophet. Think of something like the growth of Italian painting in the Renaissance. It's possible for artistic or military or political change to happen without transforming science. But every time we have a scientific revolution, everything else has to change, and it does. So what happens to Greece is completely unprecedented. They have a scientific revolution, and nobody knows what to call it or how to think about it. Nobody knows exactly what it implies or what it entails for the rest of culture. And this new scientific revolution, like all conceptual revolutions, involves, in a central way, asking better questions. In other words, you'll get much more results from asking better questions than from providing better answers, surprisingly enough. Science 1.0, which is global, asks the question, what was that? Pointing to the sky or the sun or the moon or an animal. Science 2.0, which happens in Greece about 600 BC and in China about 300 BC, asks a new question. What was that? What is that? And they are not attributing subjectivity and personality to things. They are creating the category of objects. Along with these objects are a whole set of conceptual structures for which neither Greek nor Chinese had words because these concepts hadn't been constructed yet. So give the Presocratics and the School of Naturalists in China a break. They're trying to find a way to talk about stuff that seems easy to us because we get it as a legacy. But imagine how hard it is to talk about something like space in among people whose language doesn't have a word for space. I mean, what do you gesture at? You know, space. Uh, they may just look at you, you know, with complete incomprehension. Same sort of thing with matter. They don't have an idea for matter. They have solid stuff, but the idea of matter, a substrate that all the objects in the world possess and share, uh, you know, they are hammering out new ideas: space, time, causality. Here we mean causality independent of freedom. In other words, necessary causal connection between antecedent events and subsequent events. These are not easy to hammer out. So give these guys a break. They are great geniuses. First of the important ones is named Thales. And he's famous for the claim that all is water. Now, that doesn't sound very impressive to us, but you have to remember he's trying to give an account of the physical, natural world that doesn't involve poetic make-believe, all right? A good way of thinking about it would be to say, we can't have natural science until we have nature. And we can't have nature until we pry it loose from all these ancient stories. So that's what Thales and his two students, Anaximander and Anaximenes, tried to do. They tried to give a non-mythological account of the physical world. Now, what that means is they have the idea of observation. And they say, if I can't see it in the world, I don't believe it's there. So if you think about the beginning of the Iliad, when Athena comes down and prevents Achilles from slaying everyone on the spot, Thales and his disciples are implicitly saying either he stayed his own hand or it didn't get stayed. There's none of these spooky, divine or demonic things. They are not real and they don't cause stuff in this world. So when Thales says that all is water, what he's trying to say is that matter takes the form of solid, liquid, and gas. Liquid water, if it's cold, turns into a solid, which is ice. If it's boiled and you add heat, it turns into a gas, which is steam. So what Thales is trying to do is sketch out the idea of matter having phases, or matter itself. All right? And that's not an easy idea to work out in his head, much less to explain to other people. But this new rationality and this new tendency towards criticism on the basis of observation has very far-reaching implications. The disciple, the student of Thales, Anaximander, he was trying to explain to people a very puzzling idea: the unbounded. What is the unbounded? Might I suggest that one way of thinking about it is, well, what sort of thing has no boundaries? And the only thing I can think of that would have that property is space. Of course, if you don't have a word for matter, Thales will try and help you out. Anaximander may help us out with the idea of space, among other great achievements. And finally, we have Anaximenes. And here, he's going to say that his elderly teacher was mistaken. Thales said that all is water, but in fact, all is air. And what happens is that air can be thickened up or it can be spread out. And if it's spread out, it's the kind of thing that we get in smoke and in wind and in things like that. If you pack the smoke together, what you get is liquid, and then below that, what you get is solid. So all of the phases of matter, Anaximenes is trying to say, are variations on one thing with different degrees of rarefication and compactness. Part of what he's talking about is the idea of density, of packing stuff together. He looked at, say, a campfire. You throw very solid wood on it. You add fire, which is the principle of transformation, energy, and the result is that the little bits of wood get spread out and they become a kind of air. So what these early physicists are doing is trying to hammer out the basic ideas which will make possible a new conception of the world around us. Almost every society has a word for the earth. If you think about something like the Old and New Testaments, both of them have a word for the earth, but neither of them has a word for nature. Nature is in the process of being constructed by people like Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, and once they start movement in this direction, the power of this kind of thinking begins to snowball, and it begins to build. And this is a turning point in world history. A similar turning point will happen in China a couple of centuries later, and it'll happen completely independently. Ancient Chinese physics is really interesting, but I don't have time to talk about that right now. What I do want to talk about is a couple of other issues that keep coming up here among these Presocratics. The first is, how can things change? It's an interesting problem. If a snowball melts into water and then the water evaporates into the air, how is it still one thing? How is that possible? If a thing, let's call it X, changes in some way, it's no longer X. It's Y. But if Y is also undergoing changes, then Z is actually what it'll change into. In other words, a philosopher named Heraclitus said, everything is change, all is flux. His poetic statement was, you can't step in the same river twice. Why? Well, because you put your foot in one time, you take it out and you put it in again. The river itself has moved on, and that represents the flow of time and also the flow of motion in the physical world. Since the world is undergoing constant transformation, it's always in flux, things are always moving. That means that everything is becoming something else, and nothing is permanently what it is. Now, this very quickly becomes maddening and crazy, because if you make a statement to the effect that everything is constantly changing, that statement itself would also be constantly changing. And what would the affirmation of constant change into other than the denial of constant change? So it quickly leads to contradiction and gibberish. He's trying to think about how something can change into something else, how changes in quality or location can make sense, and how they can be ascribed to one thing. So Heraclitus is the great advocate of transformation and the temporality of the world and the motion of the world make it, in some ways, an attractive stance because the only constant is change. The inverse of him, of Heraclitus, was Parmenides, and he was a great and grave figure. I have to admit, I admire Parmenides very greatly. There's a dialogue called the Parmenides in Plato's work, and Parmenides argues that nothing changes. What he says is, you must think and say that being is. Now, if being is, that means that none of the transformations in space or in time that are revealed to you by your senses, none of those are real. And the reason why they're not real is that they don't make sense. Because if being is, well, then becoming isn't. So what Parmenides is trying to invent here is logic. And he says, look, if the world isn't logical, then I'm afraid we're going to have to do a little better and improve our understanding of the world until it is logical, and we don't believe in any of the things that our senses tell us about. His student was named Zeno. He's the guy that came up with the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise, right? There's a foot race between swift-footed Achilles and a tortoise. The tortoise is given a head start. Achilles then catches up to the tortoise. But in the time it takes, the tortoise gets a little further, and then Achilles catches up to him, and the tortoise gets a little further, and Achilles catches up to him. And Zeno and Parmenides thought that what this does is prove that motion isn't possible because it doesn't make any sense. Greeks are a little too smart for their own good. And what that means is that they're advocating complete static monism, which just makes no sense at all. Knowledge and communication breaks down because there's only the one. And not even that, because you can't even talk about it. So you get an infinite plurality with Heraclitus. You get an infinite unity with Parmenides, and neither of them turns out to make any sense. If you take either of them to their logical conclusion, you'll end up talking rubbish. And that's part of what makes them interesting, but also a cautionary group, a pair of thinkers. We should also take note of Pythagoras. He's the guy that we learned about in 10th grade and when we found out about right triangles. But he was a very interesting individual because he created a sort of mathematics religion, a sort of cult of geometry and of number. And his insight was that the world is made of numbers, of quantities. And he seems to have come to this conclusion when passing a blacksmith shop, hearing the blacksmith use different size hammers and realizing that the ratio of the size of the hammer was exactly that of the different notes that they made when they hit the anvil. And then he experimented with plucking strings, and he found that the ratio of the length of the string mirrored that of the size of the hammers, and he concluded that hidden inside all of sound are numbers. And he extrapolated from that, saying that all is number. And it was an interesting gambit to try and to explain how it is that mathematics is possible, because we have many differences of opinion about what's beautiful, or about what's good, or about what sort of taste we wish to foster in society. But nobody argues about arithmetic, or at least nobody with any sense. And in some ways, Greek philosophy is directed towards asking themselves, how is that possible that we found sweet reason and there's nothing to argue about when it comes to arithmetic? The math cult has enormous significance for the development of Western science. I will pick that up again in a couple of months when I talk about the connection between Pythagoras and Isaac Newton, also Descartes. But let me stay with the Greeks for now. We get advances in a materialistic, causally necessary universe. First from a figure named Empedocles, who offered us an account of the physical world that broke things down into their elements. And this is what we mean nowadays. It's a very archaic use, but when we leave something out exposed to the elements we're talking about are earth, air, fire, and water. Right? So for Empedocles, these four elements were the building blocks of all of the natural world. Now, fire, according to Empedocles, was an element, but actually the function it serves in his account, think of a big X with E, earth, air, fire, and water. That account treats fire as an element, but in fact, it's energy, the principle of transformation. And what it imposes these transformations upon is earth, which is solids, air, which is gases, and water, which is liquids. So now we have here an account of all the elements that make up the various kinds of transformations in the physical world. For those of you that are wondering, this big chart of earth, air, fire, and water is the first draft of what will eventually become the periodic table of the elements. All right. Empedocles was a wizard, and he was a polymath, and the materialism implicit in his thinking was taken to a very great extent further by Democritus. Democritus argued for atoms, which means that all of the states of nature are in fact manifestation of some common substrate. Atoms mean indivisible little things, infinitely small, that form the various elements. Right? And you can get a pretty funny and interesting account of the world this way. It turns out that the argument that was made was that, for example, honey atoms were round, and that's why it tasted so sweet. Whereas pepper atoms, they were very sharp and jagged, which is why they tasted so hot. It's actually not a bad account. Certainly it's better than attributing it to the pepper spirit or something else like that. Now, this process of demythologizing and criticizing the Homeric tradition continued on, and it had political and social and moral implications. A philosopher named Anaxagoras claimed that the sun was a hot rock. What that means is that he had seen a rock become hot in a fire. It continued to glow after the fire was out, and instead of describing the sun as Apollo's golden chariot, it looked to him like a rock that was hot. No more magical, mythological accounts of nature. Anaxagoras is clearly living in a new age. Now, to extend that, we have a writer named Xenophanes who concludes, and quite plausibly, that this same inductive process of looking at the world and critically evaluating tradition suggests that religious skepticism is implicit here. He says that in Thrace the gods have red hair, and in Ethiopia the gods have black skin. He said if cows made idols, they would have horns and hooves. So it looks to him like the gods are fictions created by human beings. Now, that's an interesting idea. A lot to be said for that. But it is fraught with danger. And that is the big picture, which answers the question that doesn't, or which addresses the question that doesn't usually get asked. In the age of Heraclitus, why did everybody decide to get all rational and philosophical all of a sudden? In other words, why does it happen in Athens a little after 500 BC rather than in Iceland in 1,000 years earlier, or Madagascar 1,000 years later? Why Greece? Why now? And here's the answer. All right. Every transformation of science requires a transformation of every other domain of human culture. What that means is this: the Greeks were undergoing a new and unique process in human history. This had never happened before. And what it did was encourage and enlarge their understanding of the physical world. But it also dissolved the myths that held society together. The polis was a cultural whole, and politics and religion initially were indistinguishable. In other words, you couldn't have one without the other. There's no such thing as the separation of church and state in the ancient world. Politics is legitimated by religion, and religion is enforced and made permanent by politics. So when natural science emerges and it has critical implications for the myths that make society possible, all the other domains, law, ethics, politics, rhetoric, art, are all going to have to change to deal with this new intellectual milieu. And the people that did that, the people who applied this new natural science to the human world, to the humanities, they were called sophists. And what they concluded was that Anaxagoras was right. The sun is not Apollo's golden chariot, it's a hot rock. Now, that was important for them in particular because they were itinerant teachers of rhetoric, and they taught ambitious young men how to get ahead in politics. They described what this process of getting ahead in politics and learning to speak as teaching arete, which is human excellence. And this is a very new but also very defective conception of human excellence. This is a mental excellence that is equivalent to and demanded by a new intellectual vista. And the sophists took the idea, the demythologizing that the Presocratics did, and applied it to practical human life. So, for example, when back in the time of Pericles, in the golden age of Athens, if you went to a court, witnesses were not sworn in on the Bible because the Bible didn't exist and they didn't believe in it. You were sworn in by Apollo's golden chariot. You see, every morning Apollo gets on his golden chariot and rides across the sky. And he looks down on the world, and like Santa Claus, he knows who's been good and he knows who's been naughty. And at the end of the day, he goes back and tells Father Zeus who's been perjuring themselves, and Father Zeus fries him with a thunderbolt, with a lightning bolt. Okay, if you believe that perjury results in having Apollo's golden chariot tell Father Zeus to fry you with a thunderbolt, you are highly likely to tell the truth because of the danger of perjuring yourself. But once Anaxagoras tells us that it's not Apollo's golden chariot, I mean, look at it. Does it look like Apollo's golden chariot? Well, if it's a hot rock, the hot rock doesn't care whether you tell the truth or not. So that means that now you can safely perjure yourself in courts of law. And nothing matters except winning. And that means that you trick people, you make the worse argument appear the better, and you offer young men the temptation of becoming tyrants, and also becoming so slippery that any normal law can be evaded. And the sophists think that this is beneficial, and perhaps it sometimes is, but it can also be catastrophic. There are three sophists I want to remind you of before I let you go. Okay, the first, and I like this guy, is Pythagoras. He says, man is the judge, man is the measure of all things. So he's an absolute relativist. And this is the kind of internal self-contradiction that you get among the Presocratics and the sophists. If you're going to be a relativist, it's very hard to absolutize that. So there's something oxymoronic about it. On the other hand, he does say that however things appear to you is how they appear to you. And since different people have different perspectives on the world, you know, that's true for you and this is true for me. And there's no truth apart from our different perspectives. It sounds very postmodern in a way. It's in the kind of impish idea that it's possible to have relativism and then absolutize it. The next great sophist you should know about, because you're going to encounter him in Plato's Republic if you aren't familiar with it, is Thrasymachus, and his teaching is that justice is the advantage of the stronger. In other words, justice is whatever the conqueror says it is. So what it means is that might is right. If you are stronger than other people, then the orders that you give, which one assumes to be your interest or your understanding of your interest, that's what justice is. And anybody that doesn't like it will be killed, and they'll be justified in doing that because justice is whatever the powerful people say it is. It's a way of saying there's no such thing as injustice. And that sort of power politics, realpolitik, will come back and haunt the Athenians later on when we look at Thucydides' Melian dialogue, where the Athenians are actually going to say, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And that sort of arrogance, that sort of hubris, is the beginning of destruction. My final sophist is my personal favorite, Gorgias of Leontini. Gorgias went over to the dark side. He's like the Darth Vader of thinking, and I can't help but admire the guy. His rhetoric was so good, so Orphic, so mesmerizing, that he wrote a piece called The Encomium on Helen. Now you have to remember that Helen of Troy and her adulterous ways caused the destruction of a great city and thousands of Greek heroes, and take 10 years out of all their lives. And she is the image in Greek culture of the evil-doing woman. Thousands of men were killed because hers was the face that launched 1,000 ships. Well, Gorgias says, well, I could get her off because I can show that she's really not responsible. And whoever was responsible, hasn't been accused. And since we can only have pity and regret for her fate. Thus it is proven I can get Helen of Troy off. The idea is that if he can give a speech which shows that Helen of Troy is to be exonerated, he can get anybody off on any charge of any kind, because she's as guilty and as wicked as anybody that can be identified in Greek culture. I mean, she's probably worse than Medea, which is saying something. I like best, though, his final understanding or his final account of knowledge and his job in teaching speech and the other intellectual issues of his day. So he gave us three propositions. The first was, nothing exists. Now, that's a real conversation stopper if you think about it. Because if nothing exists, then you don't exist and I don't exist, and the statement that nothing exists doesn't exist, and nothing else exists either. And, well, you know, it's hard to know how to proceed. But Gorgi's going to give us a break. He says, look, if anything exists, it can't be known. And so, yeah, maybe something exists, but if it exists, nobody could know it. I guess that's homage to Pythagoras, infinite perspectives. But if there's no kind of knowledge, well then how can you tell me that nothing exists or that nothing can be known? So Gorgias says, okay, I contradict myself. Like Emerson or like Whitman, I contain multitudes. I'm not afraid of self-contradiction. So he says, look, if anything exists and any of that stuff that exists, if any of that can be known, it certainly can't be communicated. So the stuff that exists that you can know about, you can't tell anybody else about it, which is what he's doing right now. So Gorgias is embracing dividing by zero. He wants to close down all speech and thought because it's just a game and it doesn't amount to anything. And the result is he becomes famous and wealthy, and he's surrounded by idiots that he has miseducated, who turn out to be the real recompense for being a bad teacher. It's being stuck with bad students after you're done teaching them. I assume that's not the case with you. Some of you are my former students. Some are former roommates. Some used to be my doctors. But for next month, we're going to start talking about applied science or applied physics, and that's going to be technology. And what I want to do is talk about the technology of medicine. We're going to read a little bit of Hippocrates, and we're going to find out the difference between medicine 1.0, which is witch doctor medicine, magic dust and magic rattles and stuff, and amulets, as opposed to science 2.0, which is what we do with the Hippocratic school, where you have careful observations, repeated examinations, careful cataloging of symptoms, and a sifting for patterns among the observations. So this is a genuinely scientific enterprise. It's not as sophisticated as the science we will get during the Enlightenment, but it is a big step forward from the invocation of spooks and spirits as a way of curing disease. I'll see you next month. Bye-bye, doctors.